The first stage is often the most difficult to recognize because it does not initially feel like abuse. It feels like connection. It feels like being seen. And that distinction matters because psychological influence becomes strongest when it arrives wrapped in something the other person genuinely wants. An empath tends to pay close attention to emotional signals. They notice changes in tone, facial expressions, pauses, contradictions, and subtle shifts in mood. They often have a strong desire to understand what another person is feeling beneath the surface. So when someone appears to understand them with unusual intensity, it can create a powerful sense of recognition. The relationship may move quickly. There may be intense conversations, extraordinary compliments, constant communication, emotional disclosure, and a feeling that this person somehow knows you better than people who have known you for years. And this is where the psychological trap can begin. Intensity is not the same thing as intimacy. Intimacy develops through consistency, trust, responsibility, and time. Intensity can develop almost instantly. When someone gives you an enormous amount of attention in a short period, your nervous system can begin associating that person with emotional reward. You start anticipating their messages. Their approval feels important. Their attention becomes something you look forward to. The danger is not simply that you enjoy the attention. The danger is that your brain can begin assigning meaning to it. You may think, this person must really understand me. But understanding someone and studying someone are not always the same thing. A person who is highly observant can learn what makes you feel valued, what makes you afraid, what experiences shaped you, and what kind of reassurance you respond to. That knowledge can be used compassionately, but it can also be used strategically. This is why the early stage can be so confusing. The empath is not walking into the relationship thinking, I am going to be manipulated. They are thinking, I finally found someone who gets me. And once that belief becomes emotionally significant, the empath may begin interpreting warning signs through the lens of that initial connection. A sudden change in behavior gets explained away. A contradiction becomes, they are probably stressed. A disrespectful comment becomes, maybe I misunderstood. The empath does not necessarily ignore reality. They reinterpret it because they are trying to protect the meaning of the relationship they have already invested in. This is an important psychological principle. Once people become emotionally invested in an interpretation, they often work harder to preserve the interpretation than to examine the evidence against it. That is why the beginning matters so much. If someone creates a powerful emotional bond and then gradually introduces inconsistency, the contrast itself can become psychologically compelling. You remember how good it felt in the beginning. You begin waiting for that version of the person to return. And instead of evaluating the relationship based on what is happening now, you start chasing what happened before. That is where attachment can become a trap. The empath thinks, if I can just communicate better, love harder, become more patient, or understand them more deeply, we can get back to the way things were. But sometimes the version of the relationship you are trying to recover was never stable enough to be recovered. And recognizing that does not mean becoming cynical. It means learning to distinguish emotional intensity from emotional safety. Real connection does not require you to constantly earn your place in someone's life. It does not make you chronically confused about where you stand. It does not demand that you abandon your instincts to preserve the relationship. The first lesson, then, is simple but profound. Do not judge a relationship by how intensely it begins. Judge it by how consistently it treats you over time. Because when the intensity fades, character is what remains. And this is where the second stage begins. Confusion. Not the ordinary kind of confusion that comes from misunderstanding a conversation, but the deeper psychological confusion that develops when someone's behavior repeatedly contradicts the reality they presented to you in the beginning. You may notice that the warmth is still there, but it is unpredictable. One day they are affectionate and deeply engaged. The next, they are distant, dismissive, or strangely cold. You try to understand what changed, but there is rarely a clear explanation, so your mind begins searching for one. And this is important psychologically. The human brain does not like unresolved patterns. When something does not make sense, we naturally try to create an explanation. We replay conversations. We examine our words. We analyze their tone. We ask ourselves what we did differently. For an empath, this process can become especially intense because they are already highly attentive to emotional changes. So instead of asking, why is this person treating me inconsistently, the empath often asks, what did I do to cause this? That shift is critical because once you make yourself the center of the explanation, you begin carrying responsibility for behavior that may have nothing to do with you. You start monitoring yourself. Maybe I was too emotional. Maybe I asked for too much. Maybe I should have given them more space. Maybe I shouldn't have brought that issue up. Maybe if I communicate differently, everything will return to normal. Notice what is happening. The relationship has moved from connection to psychological problem solving. You are no longer simply experiencing the relationship. You are trying to solve it. And the more unpredictable the other person's behavior becomes, the harder you may work to find the missing formula. This creates a powerful cycle. When affection returns after a period of distance, you feel relief. That relief can be mistaken for proof that the relationship is improving. But psychologically, the contrast between emotional withdrawal and emotional reward can make the reward feel even more powerful. You become focused on getting back to the good moments. This is one reason inconsistent reinforcement can create such strong attachment. If positive attention were constant, it might feel normal. But when it appears unpredictably after emotional discomfort, you may become increasingly focused on receiving it again. You begin waiting, you begin hoping, you begin analyzing, and eventually the relationship can occupy far more mental space than it deserves. The empath may even start becoming hyper-aware of small signals. A short message feels significant. A delayed response becomes evidence. A change in punctuation becomes something to interpret. A facial expression becomes a psychological puzzle. This is not because the empath is weak or irrational. It is because prolonged uncertainty forces the mind into a state of heightened monitoring. You are trying to predict the emotional environment so you can protect yourself from the next shift. And that is the real danger of this stage. You slowly stop asking whether the relationship is healthy and start asking how to behave correctly enough to keep the other person stable. That is a profound psychological transition. Your attention moves away from your own needs and toward managing another person's reactions. And when that happens repeatedly, self-trust begins to weaken. You may know something feels wrong, but because the other person's behavior keeps changing, you struggle to trust your interpretation. The contradiction becomes internal. One part of you remembers the loving person you met, while another part is experiencing someone who makes you feel anxious, uncertain, or diminished. The mind wants these two realities to fit together, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes confusion is not a sign that you need more information. Sometimes confusion is information. When someone's behavior repeatedly forces you to question your perception, your worth, and your emotional stability, stop asking only, how can I understand them? Start asking, what is this relationship doing to me? Because clarity begins the moment you stop trying to decode someone else's behavior and start observing its effect on your own mind. When confusion becomes the pattern, clarity begins with trusting what the pattern is telling you. And once confusion becomes the emotional environment, the next stage often follows almost naturally: self-blame. This is where the empath begins turning inward. Instead of examining the behavior of the other person, they begin examining themselves. They ask, what am I doing wrong? And at first, that question may seem healthy. Self-reflection is valuable. Taking responsibility for your own behavior is a sign of maturity. But there is a difference between healthy self-reflection and psychological self-blame. Healthy reflection asks, what can I learn from my behavior? Self-blame asks, how can I change myself enough to stop someone else from hurting me? That distinction is enormous. When an empath becomes emotionally invested in a relationship that is unpredictable, they may begin believing that peace depends on their performance. If the other person becomes angry, they search for the sentence they should not have said. If the other person withdraws, they wonder whether they were too demanding. If conflict appears, they immediately look for their own mistake. Gradually, responsibility becomes distorted. The empath begins carrying responsibility not only for what they did, but for how the other person chooses to react. And that is an impossible burden. You cannot communicate perfectly enough to control another person's emotional responses. You cannot love someone so correctly that they become incapable of manipulation. You cannot become endlessly patient and somehow eliminate another person's disrespect. Yet the empath may keep trying. Why? Because accepting that the other person may be choosing harmful behavior is psychologically painful. It means confronting the possibility that the relationship cannot be repaired simply by giving more. So the mind chooses a more manageable explanation. Maybe I need to try harder. That belief creates a temporary sense of control. If I am the problem, then I can fix the problem. But if the problem is the other person's pattern, then I may have to make a much more difficult decision. I may have to stop participating in it. This is why self-blame can keep someone trapped. The empath becomes obsessed with becoming the perfect partner, friend, family member, or listener. They apologize repeatedly. They explain themselves. They soften their boundaries. They suppress anger. They tolerate behavior they would never recommend to someone they love, and eventually something dangerous happens. They stop asking whether their needs are being respected. They only ask whether they are being acceptable. That is the psychological shift to watch for, because when your primary goal becomes avoiding another person's negative reaction, you are no longer living from self-respect. You are living from emotional survival. You begin editing yourself before speaking. You calculate your words. You anticipate moods. You become careful about bringing up legitimate concerns because you already know what might happen, and then you may mistake your own silence for peace. But silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is fear that has learned to behave politely. The empath may even defend the person who is hurting them. They explain the person's childhood. They explain their insecurities. They explain their difficult past. They become so focused on understanding why someone behaves destructively that they forget an essential principle. Understanding someone's behavior does not require you to accept its consequences. You can understand someone's wounds and still maintain boundaries. You can have compassion without becoming available for mistreatment. You can recognize someone's pain without making yourself responsible for healing it. And this is where psychological maturity begins to emerge. The goal is not to become incapable of self-criticism. The goal is to make self-criticism accurate. Ask yourself, did I make a mistake? If the answer is yes, own it. But then ask the more important question, am I taking responsibility for something that belongs to someone else? That question can change everything, because the moment you stop accepting responsibility for another person's choices, you begin recovering something that the confusion had taken away from you, your internal authority. You no longer need to become perfect to deserve respect. You only need to become honest about what you will and will not accept. You are responsible for your actions, but you are not responsible for someone else's decision to mistreat you. And once self-blame becomes habitual, something deeper begins to happen. The mind gets tired. The emotional system gets tired. The body begins carrying the weight of a relationship that requires constant psychological effort. This is the stage of emotional exhaustion. And emotional exhaustion is different from simply being sad. Sadness comes and goes. Exhaustion changes how you function. You may wake up already thinking about the relationship. You may go to sleep replaying conversations. You may spend hours trying to understand what happened, what you should have said, or what you should do next. Even when the other person is not physically present, they can remain psychologically present in your mind. That is what prolonged emotional uncertainty can do. Your attention becomes consumed by prediction. What mood will they be in? Will they respond? Did I say something wrong? Are they angry? Are they pulling away? Should I reach out? Should I stay quiet? The mind begins operating like a surveillance system. Instead of using your attention to build your life, You use it to monitor another person's emotional state. And there is a cost to that. Attention is not unlimited. Whatever constantly occupies your attention eventually consumes psychological energy. When a large portion of that energy is spent managing instability, there is less available for creativity, relationships, work, personal goals, and even basic enjoyment. This is why someone can look perfectly functional from the outside while feeling completely depleted internally. They may still go to work, they may still smile, they may still answer messages and take care of responsibilities. But internally, something has become quiet. Their enthusiasm disappears, their confidence weakens. Things that once mattered no longer feel important. And sometimes they begin asking themselves, why don't I feel like myself anymore? That question is significant because prolonged emotional pressure can gradually narrow a person's psychological world. Instead of thinking about what they want, they think about what will prevent conflict. Instead of asking where they want their life to go, they ask how to keep the relationship stable. Their world becomes smaller, and the most dangerous part is that they may not notice it happening. There is rarely one dramatic moment when self-confidence disappears. It happens through hundreds of small compromises. You stop saying what you think. You stop expressing what you need. You stop trusting your first reaction. You forgive something you once promised yourself you would never tolerate. Then you do it again, and eventually the boundary you once considered obvious begins to feel unreasonable. This is how emotional exhaustion can reshape standards. When someone is tired enough, they stop asking for what is healthy and start accepting what is merely tolerable. But there is another psychological consequence: emotional numbness. When the mind has experienced too much uncertainty for too long, it may begin protecting itself by reducing emotional investment. You may notice that you no longer react the way you once did. Things that would have devastated you months ago barely move you now. That does not necessarily mean you have become cold. It may mean you have become overloaded. Your system has learned that constantly feeling everything is too expensive. And this is often the point where something important begins to shift. Exhaustion can expose the truth that hope was previously hiding. When you have spent enough time trying to fix the relationship, you eventually begin asking a different question. What if this is not something I am supposed to fix? That question creates space, and space creates observation. You begin seeing the relationship less through the emotional attachment and more through the pattern. You notice what keeps repeating. You notice what never changes. You notice how often you abandon yourself simply to preserve temporary peace. And slowly, exhaustion can become the doorway to awareness. Not because suffering is necessary and not because pain automatically makes someone wiser, but because there comes a moment when the psychological cost of remaining the same becomes greater than the fear of changing. That is the beginning of awakening. Because sometimes the first sign that you are ready to leave a destructive pattern is not anger. It is the quiet realization that you are tired of losing yourself. When maintaining the relationship costs you your identity, exhaustion is no longer weakness. It is a signal that something must change. And after emotional exhaustion comes one of the most important turning points in the entire process: awareness. This is the moment when the empath stops looking at individual incidents and starts looking at the pattern. That distinction changes everything. Before awareness, the mind tends to treat every conflict as a separate event. One argument is about that argument. One period of silence is about that period of silence. One cruel comment is explained as a bad day, stress, insecurity, or misunderstanding. But awareness changes the question. Instead of asking, why did this happen today? You begin asking, why does this keep happening? That is the beginning of pattern recognition. And psychologically, pattern recognition is powerful because it moves you from emotional reaction into observation. You are no longer trapped inside every individual moment. You are stepping back far enough to see the structure. You begin noticing that the same cycle keeps repeating: connection, tension, withdrawal, confusion, apology, temporary peace. Then the cycle begins again. The details may change, but the emotional architecture remains remarkably similar. And once you see the architecture, it becomes much harder to convince yourself that every incident is an isolated accident. This is where many people experience a painful realization they were not failing to communicate. They were trying to solve a pattern with individual conversations. They kept looking for the perfect explanation, the perfect apology, the perfect boundary, the perfect sentence that would finally make the other person understand. But awareness reveals something uncomfortable. Sometimes the problem is not a lack of communication. Sometimes the pattern itself is the communication. Repeated behavior tells you more than occasional promises. And this is where the empath begins recovering something that was slowly weakened during the earlier stages: trust in their own perception. Remember what happened during confusion and self-blame. The empath constantly questioned themselves. Am I imagining this? Am I too sensitive? Did I misunderstand? Maybe I'm expecting too much. Awareness does not mean assuming that every interpretation is correct. It means becoming willing to examine reality without automatically dismissing yourself. You begin comparing words with behavior, promises with actions, explanations with patterns, and that comparison is incredibly revealing because people can explain almost anything. Behavior is harder to disguise over time. Someone can promise change. Someone can apologize beautifully. Someone can describe exactly what you want to hear. But if the same behavior repeatedly returns, the pattern deserves more weight than the promise. This is also where the empath learns a profound psychological lesson. Compassion without discernment can become self-abandonment. You can understand why someone behaves the way they do and still recognize that their behavior is harmful. You can acknowledge their pain without making their pain your responsibility. You can forgive someone internally without giving them unlimited access to you. Awareness creates that separation, and with that separation comes a new form of strength. You stop asking, how do I get them to change? You start asking, what will I do if they don't? That is a radically different question. The first question places your power in someone else's hands. The second returns it to you. This is why awareness is not simply knowing psychological terminology. It is not learning a label and suddenly believing you understand everything about another person. Real awareness is much more practical. It means observing what happens to your mind around someone. Do you feel constantly anxious? Do you feel that you must perform to earn affection? Do you repeatedly abandon your boundaries to avoid conflict? Do you feel more confused after conversations rather than clearer? Do you keep waiting for someone's potential while ignoring their consistent behavior? These questions bring the focus back to reality. And reality, although sometimes painful, is psychologically liberating. Because once you can see the pattern, you no longer have to spend all your energy trying to explain it away. You can make decisions based on what is actually happening. That is the beginning of psychological freedom. Not when the other person finally admits what they did, not when they finally understand your pain, but when you no longer need their agreement to trust what you have observed. Awareness is the moment you stop asking for permission to believe your own experience. And once awareness develops, the next challenge is detachment. Now, detachment is often misunderstood. People think detachment means becoming cold, emotionless, or suddenly stopping caring. But psychologically, healthy detachment is not the absence of emotion. It is the restoration of perspective. You can care about someone and still stop allowing their behavior to control your emotional state. That is a major distinction. Before awareness, the empath may spend enormous amounts of energy trying to obtain reassurance. They want an explanation. They want an apology. They want the other person to finally understand what they did. They want the relationship to return to the version they experienced in the beginning. But after awareness, something changes. You begin realizing that closure is not always something another person gives you. Sometimes closure is the decision to stop reopening the same wound while waiting for someone else to explain why they created it. This is difficult because emotional attachment does not disappear simply because your intellect understands the pattern. Your mind may know the relationship is unhealthy while another part of you still misses the person. That contradiction is normal. You can know someone is not good for you and still miss them. You can understand the pattern and still feel emotionally pulled toward them. You can remember the harm and still remember the good moments. Detachment does not require you to erase those memories. It requires you to stop allowing memories to rewrite reality. This is where the empath begins separating potential from pattern. Potential says, maybe someday this person will become who I believe they could be. Pattern says, this is what they consistently choose to do. And mature decision-making is based on patterns, not promises of potential. This does not mean becoming bitter. In fact, bitterness can keep you psychologically connected to the person. If you spend every day thinking about revenge, proving a point, or imagining their downfall, they still occupy your mind. Real detachment is quieter. You stop explaining yourself endlessly. You stop defending every boundary. You stop chasing conversations that repeatedly produce the same result. You stop monitoring their reactions to determine whether your decision was valid. And perhaps most importantly, you stop confusing their emotional response with your moral responsibility. Someone can be angry about your boundary. That does not mean your boundary is wrong. Someone can accuse you of changing. That does not mean you are betraying them. Someone can say you are selfish because you finally started protecting your time, attention, or emotional energy. That does not automatically make you selfish. When people become accustomed to your lack of boundaries, your boundaries can feel like rejection to them. But a boundary is not punishment. A boundary is information. It communicates what you will participate in and what you will no longer participate in. And this is where the empath begins rebuilding internal authority. You stop asking, do they approve of my decision? You start asking, is this decision consistent with who I want to be? That is a completely different psychological position. Because if your peace depends on someone else's approval, you are still emotionally dependent on their evaluation. But when your decisions are guided by your values, you become much harder to control. This is why detachment is not really about leaving someone emotionally. It is about returning to yourself. Your attention comes back. Your time comes back. Your curiosity comes back. Your ability to think without constantly anticipating someone else's reaction comes back. And slowly, the world becomes larger again. You begin remembering that your life existed before this relationship and can exist after it. The goal is not to stop caring. The goal is to stop abandoning yourself in order to keep caring. Because love without boundaries can become self-erasure. Compassion without discernment can become self-neglect. And attachment without self-respect can become psychological captivity. Healthy detachment breaks that cycle. You are no longer trying to control the other person's behavior. You are simply deciding what you will do with your own life. And that is where freedom begins. Detachment is not losing your heart. It is finally refusing to lose yourself.